Today we have a special guest, an American blogger, Spaghetti Kozak, who lived and worked in Russia, has an experience with Western media, and also volunteered in Ukraine after Russia invaded our country. James definitely understands this Russia-Ukraine-West triangle, which we want to talk about, and the reasons why James is on the Ukrainian side. Hello, James.
People ask, a lot of times they ask, like, why you understand Russian so well and why you're in Ukraine. And I explained that, and they're like, so you spent all this time in Russia, like more time there than here, but you fight for Ukraine. And I said, yes, because I lived in Russia. Like, that is the best. That is the best motivation that anyone could have if they have their head on straight. So I did not need to find out about Bucha to understand that Bucha-like events would happen because, like I said, I lived in Russia. I know the kind of hatred that they promote to their population. I know not just it's the abuse that they hand out to their population, especially in their so-called army. I don't even want to call it a military because it's not. It's like an armed mob. But there's this kind of system in Russia, this dominance culture, prison culture, gulag culture, where basically everybody suppresses and abuses and humiliates the level below them. And one thing the people at the top do as a sort of like a pressure release valve is that they give them these authorized targets, the people that you can do anything to. You know, it's kind of like that concept in Russian prison of like the Petuk or Chmo, right? Like there's someone that anybody can do anything to, and you won't face any kind of consequences for it. And so in internal Russian society, this is usually, for example, LGBT people. Externally, especially in the case of the war, this would be Ukrainians. And so it was very clear from the beginning. This is the fear that I had because, like I said, I actually believed a lot of these credible experts or then credible experts that said like large parts of Ukraine are going to fall under occupation. Just imagine if a place where you have so many friends and have been there so long is just going to be, because you got to remember that after 2014, the West did nothing to really reverse that situation. And so there's a good chance. I mean, I think it was credible to believe that they would let Russia come in, take a bunch of territory, and then they would say, just like in 2014, there's no military solution. We're going to have a peace treaty. And the peace treaty, like, you know, they used to say Minsk is the only solution. And so we would just be dealing with something like that. So, of course, there's a lot of fear, a lot of anger, but I knew that they would be doing something like this because, and this is something all your audience needs to understand about the genocidal nature of Russia's war, is that Russia, they literally believe that Ukraine it's a fake country. It's a fake identity that is made up by some foreign anti-Russian coalition. And in the past, they would blame the Poles and they blamed the Austro-Hungarians. They blame Lenin. They blame the Americans in the West.
Anglo-Saxons, like Putin likes to reference to them all the time.
Yes, the Anglo-Saxons, yeah. And of course, they not as loudly as they used to in the past, but of course, they blame the Jews for all this. But you got to remember, Russia is the country that forged and disseminated the infamous protocols, this anti-Semitic hoax. And so they believe this is all just like these are Russians that have been brainwashed into thinking they're Ukrainian. But of course, whenever they come into contact with actual Ukrainians, what they find is that this identity is something real. The only way you can eliminate the identity is to eliminate the people who bear it. And that's why you get these kind of atrocities. And you can see this, kind of thing repeated in some historical genocides, like, for example, in Yugoslavia during the Second World War, there were attempts by some of the collaborators there to try to get other groups to basically say, okay, just say you're Croat. You can keep being Orthodox, but say you're Croat. And of course, that, didn't avoid various massacres. So, we're seeing the same thing where Russia says, we are the same people, we are brothers, and this, you just need to give up this fake Ukrainian identity. Well, you can't, because it's not fake, because it is real, and it is a real culture, no matter how much Russia wants to wish it away. And this is where that becomes inevitable, because you have a lot of these soldiers who they've been downtrodden their entire life because they come from the worst parts of Russia. A lot of it comes from what I will call Russia's colonial empire. They are abused throughout the army. They're filled with this propaganda telling them that you live badly because of the Americans and because of their puppets in Ukraine. And then they are just turned loose on them. And it's made very clear that they will not face any repercussions for this. Nobody in Wagner has faced repercussions, even for the executions they've done on their own men. For the videos that they promoted where they executed prisoners of war, the unit that was responsible for the Bucha massacre actually got a presidential citation from Putin, and that is a signal that you will be rewarded for this. You will not face any kind of punishment. And that is why our response to this invasion has to be uncompromising, without mercy, without pity, until they're basically all begging for it. Because otherwise, the alternative is genocide. That's what they're doing in Ukraine.
By the way,
yeah,
James,
you just kind of, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, one question, and maybe you don't have an answer for that, but you lived in Russia for a while, and what people in the West think about Russians, that there are some kind of two Russian peoples. One people is like bad, brainwashed Nazi Russians, which want to kill everyone, nuke everyone, and the other part is saint liberal Russians, which are not racist at all, not imperialistic, and just want to create the democratic United States of Russia, whatever. Did you have this like experience? Could you tell that like the Russian there are two Russian cultures, or there are like actually one Russian culture which is imperialistic, racist, shamanistic, and which led to all of this?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, if anyone thinks that Russian liberals are not racist, you should ask your closest Russian liberal what they think of the BLM protest in 2020. You will see a lot of revealing opinions. Although, I want to say, I do know a handful of Russians who are genuinely rejecting of all aspects of the chauvinism and the racism, and you also have to remember that there are a lot of ethnic Russians who grew up in Ukraine who literally fight for Ukraine. That's a different story. If we are talking about in the country, I kind of have a good experience with this because I spent most of my time there as an English teacher, and so you meet the people who tend to be more educated, more curious. And also I came there during a boom time when you had this rising middle class. And what was happening is that they were traveling a lot. And, a lot of people completely forget this, but in the mid 2000s up until pretty much, I want to say 2014, Russia was working out a deal with the European Union for visa-free travel. Yeah. And you could see a lot of Western countries, especially Germany, a lot of countries hyping up what a great investment market Russia is. And, it's this emerging market, and look how this new Russian middle class is rising. And then, of course, that middle class was very much associated with the big protests in 2011 and 2012. A couple of those I was actually witness to. And yeah, a lot of it was kind of younger Russians of the middle class variety. A lot of these people were sort of frustrated that the way Russian society is organized, you often find that you can't get above a certain station until you have a Krisha, you have somebody higher up or connection. And at the highest levels, you need to be connected to Putin or somebody who is a loyalist to Putin. And then you're allowed to be rich. You know what I mean? I have a lot of trouble with wealth inequality in the West and in the US. But the thing is, in the US, nobody will really step in and stop you if you actually invent a product that people want and it's, basically legal. For example, Facebook, right? The president, when Mark Zuckerberg was coming up, it's not like the president stepped in and said, Mark, you need to show tribute. You got to prove your loyalty, or the FCC is going to take over your social network, right? And so a lot of it was anger at at economic issues. But there was always something you could always see in those protests that was always a bit disturbing, like you see the imperial flags, you see a lot of the Russian nationalists there. And one thing about the Russian far right is that in the early Putin regime in the 2000s, as you're probably aware, some of the audience isn't, but Putin had this sort of Russia for the Russians slogan. And this is as he was going after some of the oligarchs. And in case a lot of people can't read between the lines or you don't know the culture, when he said Russia for the Russians is a little bit of an anti-Semitic dog whistle going on there, because that's what a lot of the Russian nationalists and the right believed back then, is that their country has been taken over by Jews. Russians can be funny in the sense that in 1917, they thought their country got taken over by Jews. And then they were so happy that they freed themselves from communism. And then they just claimed that the Jews took over again. So the Russians always lose, apparently. Go Jews, but there was, there was definitely the anti-Semitic implication in those slogans. And as a result, a lot of these far right nationalists, and it was a massive movement in Russia at the time, they flocked to Putin's, really to Vladislav Surkov's whole system of, creating these movements and managing everything, right? And the Kremlin had ties to these far right groups, and oftentimes these groups of skinheads and things were used as muscle to assault meetings and protests. And one example of this is actually there's a couple examples of this in some of Anna Politkovskaya's work. And obviously what happened, especially by 2010, some of those, imperialist nationalists had sort of fallen, I'd say the Kremlin sort of fell afoul of them. Like they probably, these aren't exactly very intelligent people. If they were, they wouldn't be, white nationalists.
Yeah, like that, yeah.
But they were slowly kind of waking up to the fact that no, Putin is not going to make your Slavic imperial ethno empire or whatever. And so they got dissuaded. So the Kremlin still kind of managed and kept some of these people on the payroll and everything. But there was definitely a sizable amount of them that broke off, and they would start marching with some of these bigger populist, marches by 2011. And then, of course, the Kremlin was able to get a lot of these guys back to their side in 2014, and they formed various units which fought in the occupation of Ukraine. So that was one thing that kind of concerned me about, the Russian opposition. But the other thing was that everything is so focused on simply this issue of corruption and nothing on the issue of Russian imperialism and chauvinism, because they don't.
Thank you. Oh my God. This is like, I love that, we don't say this, because whenever we say stuff like that, people say, oh, you're biased. Well, because we're Ukrainians. But it's so nice to hear it from somebody who's like not Ukrainian. Like, this is so obvious. It makes me sick sometimes.
Yeah, well,
because it's a whole thing of like, they were like whining about Russian military losing because it's so corrupt. So innately, they were like, well, if it wasn't so corrupt, we would have murdered all of these Ukrainians so much faster and everything would be great. So they're not opposing the war. They're opposing the corrupt military, which I find hysterical, because then people abroad will defend them and say, well, they're just corruption fighters. Yeah, they want an effective military to murder more Ukrainians. Great.
Yeah. And then, I often get this argument. People say, well, you cannot dispute that if Navalny were president of Russia, then this war wouldn't be happening. Well, you cannot dispute that if Lady Gaga were president of Russia, this war would not be happening. But both those people have the same chances of becoming president of Russia. Like there is no path to power for Alexei Navalny in Russia. I'm sorry. It's even if they let him out tomorrow, it's not going to happen. Putin is not so stupid as to just sort of like blink and then suddenly tomorrow there's a real parliament with a big opposition party and it's Navalny beating him in an election. It's not just going to happen. But so as far as, this is, you were surprised by my perspective on this. A lot of my perspectives over the years is going from what we get in the West, where, we get attracted to that part of the world, by Russia because our Slavic studies and everything surrounding that part of the world is so Russophilic, or at least Russia centered. It's Moscow centered, right? And as you actually, it's kind of funny, when I actually moved there and started living there, I started getting interested in everything not Russian, particularly like the minorities in Russia. So like, for example, the Russians, including many of the liberals, like they hate the people of the Caucasus and the Chechens. I was getting interested in the Chechens, meeting Tatars. I actually, know a bit of the Tatar language. Circassians, it was always interested in a lot of this, and of course Ukraine as well. And so I started over the years, you start getting the minority perspective, and it's also very instructive in the way things work in the U.S., where, if you're a white guy growing up, you don't often see things, you don't have to see things from the point of view of other groups. So you just won't. You just kind of assume you're the baseline and normal. And that's kind of the way it works in Russia, where, a Russian bragging about how great Moscow is and their history is just normal. Whereas if a Tatar stands up and says, well, wait, you massacred our people in 1552, you tried to Russify us, you still try to Russify us, you canceled our referendum in 1992, that is actually portrayed as like extremism now, because you're trying to, as they will say, spread hate or incite hatred against Russians, right? And that's the way the system is there now. And so for me, it kind of became a default now, and I follow this now, where like I tend to listen way more to the ethnic minorities or the people, Russia's neighbors, not just Ukraine, but like Kazakhstan. Besides Ukraine. So, Moldova, which of course doesn't border them anymore, but is still occupied. I started listening to those perspectives, and that's what a lot of people in the West need to do, is that, we have, when people think Slavic studies, usually like Russia just comes up every time. If there's Slavic languages available to study somewhere, Russian. Every time, even though Russian is not the best Slavic language to start with. For an English speaker.
This is so good, because I've been speaking about this for such a long time. I'm like actually almost crying, because a lot of the people in the West, especially, who say they like Russia, who, praise the Russian culture, they don't have actual knowledge of what Russian culture is, because they only experience it through like literature and art on their Slavic, actually Russian departments of the universities. Whereas if you actually go to Russia, if you actually get to experience it, you find out it's not that great. And this has been my like go-to argument usually, because like, well, how can a country that has created such beautiful poems be so horrible and full of hatred and full of just genocidal freaks? And I keep saying things like, well, because this is not what Russia is. You just experience a small part of it, which is not representative of the whole thing. And while you said it, because you're kind of smoothly transitioned to the thing we wanted to ask you also, is, well, what do people in the States, especially in the West, what do they think about Ukraine? Because we think we know what they think about us, but maybe there's something outside of our bubble that we did not, that we don't account for. Is there something very specific and something that you can, point at that would be useful or interesting to know?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, Americans don't think a lot about the outside world in general. And that's something actually that a lot of Russians get very angry about, because I had a friend who said this long before Timothy Snyder did, but Timothy Snyder said it in a famous interview on PBS, where he said the average Russian thinks about the United States several times a day. The average American thinks about Russia when they have to. Now, unfortunately, that also applies to Ukraine. And one thing, as we were talking earlier about how everything Slavic is kind of just lumped in as Russia, right? And so when Americans think, when our pop culture, talks about Ukraine, we just think like, it's that weird part of the world where people write backwards R's and backwards N's, and it's just kind of like another Russia. And there's like one annoying thing to me is like the Slav memes, right? With like the squatting Gopnik, right? It's like that kind of like that's really a Russia and former Soviet space kind of thing. I mean, other countries kind of have their equivalent to the Gopnik, but that is a very Russian thing. I don't think you would, when you talk about Slavs in America, people are not thinking of like Bosnian Muslims, for example, which would be a very different culture. And I know the Balkans, they have their own equivalent to like the Gopnik and stuff like that. But yeah, it's in America, it's just kind of like, a lot of people are like, what's the difference, But there is a very big difference. The biggest difference is that Ukrainians do not have this like white hot hatred and resentment towards America as much of Russia does. And most importantly, the Russians who decide things, have this hatred. But also, I think Ukraine is a lot more like the United States in the sense that there's a much stronger sense of individualism and rebelliousness and, also political thinking. I mean, Americans are not extremely politically literate, but they do think a lot about politics for better or worse. And that's something you see more of in Ukraine, because like in Russia during the boom, a lot of the middle class people who, they would complain about Putin. None of them liked Putin, but they were starting to make money and they were learning English and they were taking vacations to Barcelona and going to London, even going to New York and stuff like that. And they just didn't care about politics. If you brought up politics, they'd say, we don't care. It's all rigged. It's all fake. Russia will always be ruled by corrupt, strong people because we are too lazy and corrupt. It's kind of funny because like Russia has this dual ideology where it's like we're a superior civilization and culture and we're the true bearers of like true European tradition culture. But at the same time, like we're also inevitably corrupt, lazy, and we need this like strong dictator to rule over us. And it's kind of like the twin pincher attack that the system teaches everyone there, is that, you need this corrupt structure, but also we're some kind of great civilization and great power and anything that is, anything in between is just either our vassal or it must be the U.S. vassal. But yeah, it's funny you brought up like Dostoevsky and poetry and all this stuff like that, literature, is that, yeah, like Russia, like when you go to, when I lived there, it's like, yeah, you're not like dropping Dostoevsky quotes all the time. And it's not like, people just dropping in French phrases like in War and Peace or something like that. It's actually like, it's more Gopniks and angry people and stuff like that. And in fact, I will say this, like I've read many of the classics of Russian literature, including Brothers Karamazov and War and Peace, Crime and Punishment. And I will say, and I will die on this hill, that Warhammer 40K literature is superior to the entire body of Russian classic literature.
Yes,
I was afraid to say something else. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I will
100% agree.
I will put Dan Abnett's Eisenhorn, Ravenor, Beckwin, I guess you call it a cycle because it's like 9 books at present. I will put that ahead of Dostoevsky's entire catalog. There are precisely 0 Space Marines in all of like Russian literature.
How dare they?
Yeah, and and I tell you this, I remember a lot more from Eisenhorn than I did from Brothers Karamazov. So, just cope with that, Russia, and cope with that, Russian studies majors. So.
Yeah.
Oh my God! Because nobody will ever say this, but you're so brave. You're so brave.
Everybody's thinking it. I just say the thing that's on everyone's mind. Everyone is walking around thinking like, the Matrix is better than War and Peace, and it's like they're right, But no one has the courage to say it. I shoot from the hip,
And also Dostoevsky. If you look at Dostoevsky is a true representative of Russian culture, and if you look, for instance, at Crime and Punishment. The whole book is just trying to get in the head of a murderer of just like a crazy murderer and try to justify his actions. And this is what Russians are doing constantly, right? They're like, yeah, we're murdering, and then we're just trying to get like, right, like, why did we do that? Is it okay? Is it not? All right.
Well, because the issue is that
because we can, and that means we're humans and people. You know.
Oh yeah.
Well, you see, I think what a lot of people in the mainstream media won't talk about this is that so the old pawnbroker lady that he murders with an axe, she was actually being paid by the United States to join NATO. She was going to join NATO, and that naturally threatened Raskolnikov, the hero of the story. So really, like, he had no choice without security assurances. He had no choice but to kill that old lady with an axe before she became a NATO old lady, and then the invasion.
She just basically provoked him. She provoked him. She just did.
I mean, she was a Nazi. She was a gay Nazi.
Jewish gay Nazi.
Jewish gay Nazi who was planning to attack him. Doesn't matter that it was the 19th century and the Nazi party wouldn't exist. I think when he wrote that book, Hitler hadn't even been born. So, but it doesn't matter because we're using the Russian definition of Nazi, which is anybody that you particularly don't like or anybody who gets in the way of Russian foreign policy goals. Right, exactly. So, the point is that like she had it coming, and the mainstream media won't say this, and they won't let me say this on CNN. They won't let me do that. So what does that
Tucker should get on it like immediately.
If he had a show, he would probably do that. Yeah.
Ooh, but he doesn't.
What happened?
I'm on a show now, and Tucker's not. So
So our ratings are officially higher than Tucker's right now.
Also, he wears a bow tie a lot. I actually got 2 bow ties on right now. I got dual bow ties.
I got a cat ears. This is like so much better.
They both spin too. It generates a lot of lift.
The cat ears are like deconstructed bow tie. You got it?
Yeah, literally.
Yeah, actually, if you just put them together, then there's a bow tie. So, I already like your show because we really get down to the issues that a lot of people don't talk about and they're afraid to talk about. Really,
that's true. Mark.
Yeah. So look, we switched to Tucker Carlson, and because of that, I wanted to ask you: we are like, not that we don't understand, but we are. We were extremely surprised that there are forces in the United States that not just like don't care about Ukraine, but actively oppose helping Ukraine, actively support Russia, and those forces are not that marginal. Could be like, I don't know, 20 to 30% of American voters. TV hosts like Tucker Carlson, billionaires like Elon Musk's, and like other guys from the Valley we won't name. How did it happen? Like,
David Sachs.
Yeah.
How did that happen? Yeah.
Well, that's a long story too, because I've seen a lot of various extremist ideologies in the States, and the way, and I can trace the history of some of this Russophilia back many years, if not decades. But one thing I say, first of all, they aren't really as sizable and influential as people think. They're just extremely loud, and there are people amplifying them. So the fact is that, and I've heard this many times, people say, like, I have an uncle who is diehard MAGA Trump guy, but he hates Russia, and he says we got to support him. Now, does that matter if he goes and votes for Trump and Trump are president and cuts off aid? No. Okay. But the fact is that even for, one thing about the MAGA movement that's very different from conservatives in the past, especially the Bush era, is that there's a lot, like they're so ready to basically bash America, whereas in the Bush years and the Iraq War years, if you criticize American policy, you were the America hater. You're the one who has to leave. You're not patriotic. You want America weak. You want to surrender to Al Qaeda. And so that's been the big shift, is away from that sort of Bush era war on terror, hooray for America, patriotism. A lot of those same people who would call you a traitor for questioning the Iraq war in, say, 2004, they'll call you a warmonger today if you say that Ukraine has the right to defend itself. Or, even earlier, before the big invasion, if you criticized Assad or something like that, these people had no problem calling you a warmonger. And but the thing is that the ordinary person, if they support Trump because they're just Republican and they want to vote for, and maybe they agree with the other stuff he says, doesn't mean they're entirely ready to basically go over into the fuck America camp, which historically is more of like the radical left Chomskyite part of politics. And the thing is that these people don't really have that much influence as people think. And I've seen that, recently talking to people who are talking to congressmen. It's really just a tiny like ultra MAGA caucus on the Republican side. And it's a little ultra left. I wouldn't even call entirely left, like people like Ro Khanna and stuff like that. I would not really call him that leftist, but he is a Democrat. These are the people who are, kind of opposing, aid for Ukraine. One thing is that a lot of people need to understand, I try to put this out as much as possible, is that first of all, the United States decided to deliberately insert itself into Ukraine's business in 1994, to not just denuclearize it, but also to scrap or remove some of Ukraine's strategic bombers and things like that. Bombers, which if Ukraine still had them, we could basically potentially launch, long-range cruise missiles at Russia from outside, the territory where they could do anything about it. Same way they're doing to Ukraine, because they have like Tu-160s and Tu-22s, and they'll fly over the Caspian, launch over there, right? And so we basically disarmed Ukraine, pressured Ukraine into doing this, along with also Belarus and Kazakhstan. We gave those nukes and some of the bombers back to Russia. We did everything possible to please Russia in the 90s. And of course, they didn't appreciate any of this. Instead, they blame us for basically situations that they created. And so we inserted ourselves into that. So when people say Ukraine is not our business, like, well, we made it our business once, and so it's going to stay our business. And the other thing about this is that when we see the big dollar amounts, this is very funny. People who tell you they don't trust the media, and I don't trust the mainstream media, they will read headlines and immediately trust them when they say that this many millions or this many billions are in a new aid package to Ukraine, when they don't understand that most of the time that cost, that is the value of the military aid that is being sent over. It was already paid for our use, in some cases decades ago. A lot of that is going to expire at some point. We're definitely not going to use it. And what that means is that we'd actually pay more to dispose of that weaponry than we'd pay more than we do to send it to Ukraine. So what we're doing now actually is a cost saving thing. And instead of paying to dispose that weaponry, we are paying less to dispose of Russians. And so it's a much better deal. You call art of the deal.
Do you think
it's a win-win? Weapons are happy because they get to do their job. And
yeah. I mean, the missile knows where it is because it knows where it isn't, and it knows where it wants to be.
Yeah.
Oh,
exactly.
So that's the voiceover here and there.
Yeah, that's the voice. That's the missile talking. Actually, this is not James. That's not him. It's just a large missile sitting there thinking.
I know where I am because I know where I'm not. Yeah.
Do you think it was like this military packages, assistance packages transferring? Do you think it was communicated not good enough by the Biden administration, that it had so much attention to this billions of dollars they're sending all the time? Like
I'm not sure I wouldn't necessarily blame the administration here, but the media more. I do know that, when we talk about, when you want to emphasize like how good an aid package is, it makes sense to say it's like this many $1 billion. But really, I have to blame the media, because occasionally what you'll see is the headline, right? And it says like $3 billion in Ukraine aid package. And then you'll look in the lead article and it'll say like they are sending weapons and equipment equal to about $3 billion, right? So they'll actually say the truth. But they know, and newspapers have known this for years, is that most people only read the headlines.
Yeah.
And if they see something like that in the headline, it just sounds like people, or I should say, it makes it easier for bad actors to create the impression that we are just loading up pallets of money or big sacks of money with dollar signs on them, and we're just like driving them to Zelensky's house, where he's using all that to buy MTAC brand military gear to wear in press conferences. Which, by the way, your audience probably doesn't know this, but MTAC is a Polish like military equipment company, clothing company, but most of the products are made in Ukraine. And right. And a lot of times when you see Zelensky out there, I've seen him, he wears MTAC products and they are basically dirt cheap. So it's not like he's got this super Gucci like shell jacket or whatever. Those like you can get that for like maximum $50.
He was once caught in sneakers, if I'm not mistaken, New Balance sneakers, which were kind of exclusive, and they costed around $250 or $300. And I guess, yeah, that was a big scandal.
Yeah, how dare he? But no, come on. Smaller scandal than Zelensky daring to show up not in a suit where people usually wear suits. Oh my God.
I'm glad you brought that up because that was like, it gives you a taste of how our American, especially our American conservative media space works. Because here's the thing. If he had shown up in a suit, do you know what the story would be? His people are at war. Why is he going to America dressing up in a fancy, expensive suit? I bet that suit cost no less than $800. It's probably custom tailored, and he's just like at a cocktail party or something. Yeah. But of course, he didn't do that. He showed up in basically a relatively, reasonably priced military, surplus type gear, and now they're angry because he was, wearing that and not a suit. So you have to understand, you cannot win with these people. Same thing with like what we see going on in the war. Russia has taken like the final street in Bakhmut, and they're treating this like it's, I don't know, Operation Bagration or something. Whereas, when Ukraine takes all this land and kicks them out of Kharkiv Oblast, it's like, oh, yes, but can they sustain this? Or, can they, what if Russia mobilizes more people? And it's funny because like even in Bakhmut now, it's like a lot of people have this like video game understanding of war, and they think that, okay, Wagner guys, they got on the last objective point and they held it for like 2 minutes. And so now they win the whole city. And it's like, look at their flanks. Their flanks are crumbling. They're going to be in trouble very soon. And then, of course, it's just the absurdity when you look at Bakhmut is like, where it was from the original line in 2015, as one friend of mine pointed out, it's like an ambitious afternoon walk to get there. And they spent basically a year and tens of thousands of casualties for something like this. So a lot of people, even people who are supposedly on our side, they will panic over something like that, and then they will basically criticize every major gain the Ukrainian military gets. And I guarantee you, I mean, we could kick them out of the entire country at some point, and they'll say, yes, but they didn't get to Moscow. And,
That is true. That's true.
Be patient. We'll get there, but by other means.
Thank you very much, James. It was a really huge pleasure to talk to you.
It was a pleasure. It was one of our greatest, most interesting podcasts ever. That's
true.
And
I hope to invite you again, and hope you will come to our podcast again, and we'll talk again. Maybe when there will be some big news from the front lines.
Wink, wink.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm hoping not to miss that news myself. I'm hoping to get back before anything major. But it's very fun being on here. I always wanted to have my own podcast, but I'm just like too lazy to actually do all the production value. The talking part is easy. It's the editing afterwards that's a real pain. So, and then things like cameras burning out and feeds cutting out and everything. So it's much better to be a guest on someone else's podcast, I think.